Chapter 2. The ring and the loaf in the soft folds of Willowbrook's hills, laced with secret footpaths. Life flowed with a comforting predictability. The village thrived on its quiet routines, and its people preferred it that way. Nothing unusual stirred the air until it did. At precisely 8:10, Margaret Lennox unlocked the heavy wooden door of Lennox's bakery and flipped the sign to open. A bell jingled as she stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of flour and the faint tang of last night's sourdough starter. In the back, her husband, Thomas, shaped dough with the steady calm of a man who never hurried, neither his words nor his temper. By 8:30, the regulars trickled in. Mr. Bartlett, the retired schoolteacher, arrived first, still counting out change to the exact penny. Young Lily Smay followed, her son tugging at her hand, demanding a ginger biscuit before breakfast. Last came Mrs. Agnes Hartridge, small and wiry, her frown etched like a permanent seam across her face. Having lived in Willowbrook for nearly 50 years, Agnes claimed she'd seen it all: marriages, thefts, floods, and gossip so thick it could silence the vicar. "Morning, Mrs. Hartridge," Margaret said, brushing flour from her hands and adjusting her apron. Agnes grunted. "Don't suppose you've any seeded barley left?" "As it happens, one small loaf," Margaret replied, reaching behind the counter. "Ma'am," Agnes muttered, eyeing the bread with suspicion. "Hope it's not underbaked like last week." Near cracked a tooth. "Peek through, I promise," Margaret assured her. Agnes handed over the exact change no more. No lesson left without a thank you. That was Agnes. Her husband had passed 6 years ago, her cat last spring, and the world, it seemed, had only grown bleaker since. At her narrow house, with its uneven path and moss-covered gate, Agnes brewed her tea and sliced into the warm loaf, its crust still faintly crackling from the oven's heat. She intended to eat just a slice or two, saving the rest for supper. But as her knife cut through the center, it hit something solid. Clink. Agnes froze. Bread didn't clink. She parted the loaf with her fingers, and there, nestled impossibly among the soft barley crumbs, was a ring. Her first thought was a prank perhaps the Lennox boys, Thomas and Margaret's sons, now grown but once mischievous. Her second thought was slower, colder. This looks expensive. The ring was delicate, feminine, its rose gold band curling like a vine cradling a deep blue sapphire knot, a modern coutant, the small pearls nestled on either side. It was the kind of ring passed down through generations, not bought. It was lovely. It was also unmistakably not hers. Agnes turned it over, peering closer. Something about it tugged at a memory, faint but insistent. She rose from the billet table and crossed to the sitting room where a framed photograph sat. Fading on the mantel a snapshot of the Willowbrook spring garden party from 2 years ago. Villagers smiled under bunting, clutching teacups and paper plates of sponge cake. There, in the second row, smiling too brightly for someone so shy, was Eleanor Blake, and on her hand, unmistakable, was the ring. Agnes sank into her armchair, the ring heavy in her palm, the memory heavier still. "Something strange I found in my bread." There was a pause. "Bread? Yes, from Lennox's. I know how it sounds, miss." Marple, who had spent decades learning that the most unassuming details were often the most important, agreed immediately. By 1:30 she was seated in Agnes's motor sitting room with a china cup in hand and the ring placed before her. She did not touch it. She observed it first, while she said, "Finally, that's not something Garn expects to find in a barley loaf." "No," Agnes said, "and what's more, I think, it is to belong to Elelina." Blake, Miss Marple's eyes didn't widen, but they sharpened. "Do you remember when Elelina disappeared, of course? Everyone thought she ran off, but She wasn't the sort. She loved her cat, and she always returned her library books. Early Miss Marple nodded slowly. I remember thinking it odd. She never withdrew money from her account again. Never sent word to anyone. I did mention it to the constable at the time, but there was no evidence. She rose and looked out the window toward the Lennox bakery, barely visibly at the far end of the lane. Would you mind if I kept the ring for the time being? She asked. You're not going to the police? Eventually, said Miss Marple, tucking it into a handkerchief. But first, I'd like to speak to Margaret Lennox, discreetly, just to see what she says. When asked whether she's lost something outside the clouds, began to gather the sun tucked itself behind a slow, sullen gray, and the first hints of a storm crept into the wind end. Somewhere not far from Willowbrook's tidy heart, someone who thought a secret was buried for good was about to learn that bread could rise. Again with Morathon just east. Chapter 2. The Baker's Wife Stumbles. Bell above the bakery door chimed twice, gently, politely, as Miss Marple stepped inside. Lennox's bakery that afternoon, the warmth hit her immediately fuller in the air, the earthy temps of dough rising somewhere behind the shelves, and the faintest undertone of scorched cinnamon from a bun ray forgotten too long. It was homely comforting, like most things in Willowbrook, until you looked close at Margaret. Lennox stood behind the counter, arranging a tray of buttered scone. Her smile was automatic and polite, the kind of smile given to customers and Sunday school parents, not quite reaching the eyes Miss Marple. She said, brushing her hands against her apron, "How lovely, we haven't seen you in a while." I didn't eat quite so much bread these days, Miss Marple replied, gently removing her gloves, "but I do enjoy your scones. I was wondering if you had any fresh toady just out of the oven. Lovely May, I also trouble you for a small barley loaf." The seated, kind Margaret hesitated only for a breath, perhaps even less, but Miss Marple saw it, noted it, the slight tension in the shoulders, the flick of a glance towards the back door, the polite mask being lowered into place. "Certainly," Margaret said, at last moving toward the side shelf. Miss Marple used the moment to glance at the counter, crumbs from rye and honey heat, an open ledger. Nothing out offless, but something had been disturbed today. And not just in the lost. Margaret returned with the loaf wrapped in paper. "Will that be Allie? Believe so? Oh, one question, if I may." Miss Marple leaned slightly on her umbrella. "Have you lost a ring recently?" Margaret blinked. "I'm sorry, a ring? A woman's ring? Rose gold, rather old, with a blue sapphire, and 2 little pearls." The bakery went very still. Even the soft clink of trays from the back had quieted. Miss Marple waited. "No," Margaret said slowly. "I don't think so." "Are you sure, miss?" Marple asked, with that same mildness that had disarmed half of England's liars. "You see, one was found inside a loaf of your bread this morning." Margaret's throat worked once inside. "Loaf? Yes. Quite unusual one, might almost call it. Theatrical. Imagine poor Mrs. Hartridge's surreptitiously slicing into it with her bread knife." Margaret's hands dropped beneath the counter, fidgeting with something unseen. I can't imagine how that could have happened. We don't put anything into our dough. Certainly not jewelry." "Sure you don't," Miss Marple said kindly. "It must be terribly upsetting. Do you mind if I ask, was anyone else working with the dough yesterday? Perhaps Thomas?" Margaret hesitated again. "This time longer. My husband always does the mixing." "Weigh the ingredients," said the timer's pet. "The shaping and folding, that's his hands, of course." Miss Marple looked around the shop once more, and Elalina Blake. The change was immediate. Margaret stiffened and her eyes flicked just briefly to the door marked "Staff Only." "Lena hasn't worked here in nearly a year." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but she once did. Was she here the day before she disappeared?" Silence bloomed in the space between them. Margaret's eyes dropped to her flour-dusted hands. "She was." she said at last. She was working part-time after her mother did a few mornings a week. It wasn't much, but she seemed grateful. Did anything seem strange that week? I didn't think so at the time, Margaret replied. Quite no. She came in late twice, which wasn't like her. She looked tired. Then on Thursday, she didn't turn up. We tried phoning, went to her cottage, nothing. Jevrione said she'd run off. But you didn't think so? Margaret looked upsettingly vulnerable in the harsh afternoon light slanting through the bakery windows. No, she didn't seem like a threatening type. She was gentle, cautious, nervous sometimes, but she loved this village. She'd taken over her mother's garden, came to church. Miss Marple nodded slowly. You liked her? Margaret hesitated. Yes, I did. She was a bit of flight in the morning, even when she was quiet. Do you know if she had a ring like half one I described? She wore something, Margaret whispered. Sometimes, not every day, but I remember it small, with a stone that caught the oven light. She used to take it off to Mead. Said she didn't want to ruin it. A long pause. She kept it in her apron pocket, Margaret said. Finally, at least once, she did. Miss Marple tilted her head. And the aprons, are they washed? Harold Margaret nodded. We do it ourselves each evening, but if something was left in a pocket, it could go into the laundry bin, be shaken out later, or end up on the counter, and if someone didn't notice, I might end up in the dough mess. Marple finished unintentionally. Soft exhale from Margaret, like a woman who hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. But why would Ilalana have left it behind? Margaret asked. Eve left the village. Why not take something so personal? Perhaps, Miss Marple said. She never left. The words floated there, heavy as thunderclouds. Margaret swallowed. Do you think something happened to her? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that Elanina Blake did not go far, and that the loaf carried her ring has just delivered her final message. Miss Marple paid for her scone and loaf, and left the bakery with the same quiet poise she had entered with. But behind her, the mask had cracked. Margaret Lennox sank onto the stool behind the counter, pale as flowers, staring at the wall, as Ifit had spoken back at Church Street. Miss Marple Placette wrapped ring carefully into a small velvet-lined box. Sighed. The air had cooled, clouds moved in, and somewhere a question was beginning to form like fog over the fields. If Eleanor hadn't left, then where was Sam, and more to the point, who had made sure she stayed hidden? Chapter 3. The Catan, the garden shed. There are places in every village that go unnoticed, have 4 gated corners, tucked behind overgrown fences, cobwebbed sheds with warped doors and pathways once regularly walked, that no longer lead anywhere at all. In Willowbrook, one such place lay behind the old Blake cottage at the end of Lavender Row, and it was there, as the day darkened a gentle evening, that Miss Marple made her quiet way. The cottage itself had stood empty since Elanina's disappearance 10 months ago. No one had rented it. A few out-of-town buyers had looked and turned away, disturbed perhaps by the lingering silence of the place, or by the stories that circled it like wasps on fallen fruit. Elanina's cat had been taken in. B. the vicar's wife, a tabby creature named Mistletoe, who had grown fat on tuna and old scone and rarely left the church garden. Sex. The tame Miss Marple had been passing the vicarage on her way home when she'd spotted the cat slipping through the gate, tail high, moving with purpose. She would have let it be, if not for one thing. It was heading toward the Blake cottage, curious and not given to ignoring small signs. Miss Marple followed at a distance, her boots soft on the moss-streaked cobbles. She saw that Tabby hopped the low garden wall, disappeared behind a hedge, and nudged open the warped wooden door of the garden shed. She waited a moment, then followed it. Shed had once been used by Ilalana's mother for potting, bulb storing seed packets and keeping her beloved hydrangeas trimmed to perfection. It sagged, slightly one side, eaten by ivy, the door barely hanging on its rusted hinges. Miss Marple paused before entering listening. Soft meow echoed from inside. She pushed the door open with her gloved hand. The light inside was dim, filtered through a crack in the slats and the gaps in the roof, where sunlight fell in sharp lines across the dust. The air smelled of soil, and old wood mistletoe sat on the floor, tail wrapped neatly, staring at something in the back corner. Miss Marple stepped carefully across the threshold, eyes adjusting to the dimness there. Beneath a top, partially folded away, was a small, sun-bleached suitcase, the kind sold in village shops. In the 1970s, it was latched, but not locked. Dusted, time had dulled the color to gray. She knelt, slowly, carefully, and opened it. Inside, neatly folded, were women's clothes. A blouse, a soft wool cardigan slipper, and beneath them, a photograph, Elenina, younger perhaps, in her early 20s, standing by the willow tree behind the cottage with her mother. They were smiling. That was striking, because in Olaf, Miss Marple's memories of Elenina, she had smiled only rare a lot. The very bottom of the case was a letter, not posted, not addressed, folded dons and tucked under a yellowing handkerchief. Miss Marple hesitated, then opened it. "I didn't know what to do," he says. "I can't tell anyone. That no one would believe me anyway. He's done something I don't know what, but he says, if I speak, it'll be worse. I think I saw something I shouldn't have in the bakery. I wish I could forget it. I think I might leave if I don't come back. I'm sorry." There was no name, no date, just those trembling words written in a hand Miss Marple recognized from the church flower wrote her. She folded the letter Bekinto, the handkerchief, and gently closed the suitcase. The cat meowed again, this time more insistent, and padded toward the door. Miss Marple followed back in her sitting room with dusk pressing against the windows. Miss Marple sat in silence for some time. The suitcase rested on the floor beside her runapan again, as though it might vanish back into that shed if left to. Long she thought about the letter, about Elenina's fear, about what she might have seen in the bakery, about the ring and the loaf. It was not enough to prove anything, but it was enough to stir the shape of a shadow. Behind the village's clean white curtains, at that moment, a knock came at. The door rat was Constable Hopkins, tall and ruddy, and perpetually flustered around Miss Marple. Not because she was unkind, but because she so often knew more than he did. Deafening. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat, "heard you had a word with Margaret Lennox earlier today." "Yes," she replied mildly, "about a ring found in one of her loaves. We've had a few calls about it." He had made a bit of a stir in the village imaging, so he shifted on his feet. "You don't happen to have it, do you, the ring?" I mean, Miss Marple nodded and rose to retrieve the small box. She opened it carefully. Hopkins stared at that. "A proper piece, that is." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "It once belonged to Elenina. Black, or so it seems." Hopkins scratched his neck. "You'd think it was planted some sort of warning, I think," she said, handing him the folded letter to Elenina. Blake saw something, and that she was frightened enough to write these read in silence. When he looked up, his face was pale. "Good heavens," he whispered. "You think she was killed?" "I think she never left Willowbrook," Miss Marple said softly, "and someone may have used that loaf to ensure her voice was heard long after she was silenced." This constable sat down heavily. "You'll need to look into the shed behind her cottage," she added, "and perhaps speak with Thomas Lennox Hopkins." Blinked the baker miss. Marple gave a small nod. "Margaret said he does all the mixing, the shaping. If something or someone was hidden where a flour and kneading to cover everything else, well." She trailed off. Hopkins stood. "Slowly we'll need to search the properties, but quietly. Whoever did this may believe their secret is still safe." Hopkins' Cage touched his cap. "You always were one step ahead, Miss Marple, only by watching what others overlook, she said with a faint smile. That's the secretus. He left the room, settled into stillness again outside. The wind moved through the branches like whispered name sand. Far down the lane, the light in the bakery window was extinguished except for the flour. Stained apron the next morning arrived with a deceptive stillness. Mist curled between the hedges like breath held in suspension. The whole of Willowbrook seemed to wake slower than usual, as if the village itself was bracing for something it could not name. Inside Lennox's bakery, the air was unusually quiet. No cheerful clatter of trays. No warm scent of cinnamon or sultanas wafting toward the door of the shelves. Remained partly unstocked, and even the front bell, that familiar, friendly chime, hadn't rung. One scene, the back room. Thomas Lennox stood alone. He was a tall man, built like a butcher more than a baker, with hands broad and cracked by years of kneading and scraping. This morning, however, he wasn't shaping dough. He wasn't prepping yeast. Was staring down at something in the corner of a worked-in apron, rolled up and tied tight with a length of twine. His face was blank, his jaw tight undone. The rest of the room smelled faintly of rising dough. Something sour hung in the air. Not quite spoilage, but the sharp edge of anxiety left a long toe ferment. He untied the bundle slowly. The apron was old, not one of the new ones Margaret had bought last autumn, but a faded blue-striped one they used to keep for part-time staff. One pocket was torn at seam there, stained into the fabric. Just above the tear was something that didn't belong in a bakery. A faint brown smear, the kind that could have been chocolate or coffee or something else entirely. Lithimus stared at it, and then he shoved the apron back into the bundle and dropped it into the bin beneath the sink. But what he didn't notice, or perhaps pretend not to, was that someone was watching him from across the street. Young Elsie Pritchard, who worked afternoons at Depot's office, had paused on her way to work. She stood beside her bicycle, one boot on the pedal, eyes fixed on the bakery window. She had seen Mr. Lennox carry something wrapped in cloth from the back room. She'd seen the hesitations, stiffness, in the way he looked over his shoulder, like someone might be behind him. Elsie wasn't a gossip by nature, but like most villagers, she knew exactly where to take things that didn't sit right. By 11 o'clock, Miss Marple had made a quiet visit to the vicarage. By midday, Constable Hopkins stood inside Lennox's bakery with the apron in a sealed plastic bag, and Thomas Lennox with his arms folded tight. "What's this about?" Thomas asked, voice low but cordial. "Investigating the disappearance of Elalina," Blake Hopkins replied, watching him closely. "You were one of the last people to see her." "She worked here," Thomas said flatly. "She stopped showing up, that's all." "I know. Did you ever see her wearing this apron?" Thomas didn't answer. "Her ring was found in a loaf baked here 2 days ago. You do the mixing, don't you?" "Not always, but usually." Another silence. "Where were you the evening after Elalina disappeared?" Minus gave a hard snort. "Is this an interrogation, Hopkins?" "I've lived here 20 years. I've run this bakery without trouble. That girl left because she wanted to. That's it. But she didn't take her ring," Hopkins said evenly. "She didn't take her cat. And now a blood-stained print with her ring's last known hiding place has turned up in your beanie." "Don't know anything about that." Hopkins studied him. "We'll be conducting a full forensic review of the premises, including the cellar and the oven." Thomas's eyes flared. "Can't be serious." Hopkins didn't blink. Lithimus's jaw worked, but he said nothing more. Outside, Miss Marple waited on a bench just up the lane. She had not interfered in the questioning, nor would she, but her presence was a reminder, quiet and persistent, that the village was watching, that someone was paying attention. She looked down the lane toward the Blake cottage. She thought about the suitcase, the letter, the ring, and then, quite suddenly, she remembered something small. something seemingly unimportant, a conversation in the church garden. 3 months ago, it had been a sunny Sunday afternoon market. Lennox had been there, setting out cakes for the women's charity. Tish seemed flustered that day, having burned a tray of lemon biscuits, and Shed mentioned almost offhandedly that Steamus had taken to doing the night shift at the bakery, insists the bread rises better in that quiet, she'd said with a brittle smile. But what bread needed rising at 1 o'clock in the morning back in her sitting room? Miss Marple retrieved a small leather-bound notebook. She kept forming this just like this. She turned to the date in question, the week Elenina had vanished, and scanned her scribbled in trees garden committee church, roof repairs, and yes, there it was heard, odd noise in your bakery just past midnight, like something dragged too late to investigate. She had written it off at the time, but no, a knock at her door drew her back. It was Margaret Lennox. Her face was Pally's-rimmed red, as though she hadn't slept. She held her handbag in both hands, like it might keep her anchored. "I need to speak with you," Margaret said. "Quietly, please." Miss Marple nodded and stepped aside at the sat in the front parlor, the cat asleep in its usual patch of sunlight, clock ticking softly above the mantel. "I didn't come earlier because I wasn't sure," Margaret began. "But now, after the police came, after I saw what they found, he can't stay silent." Miss Marple waited. "I think Lelanina was trying to tell Mezzanethan that week." "Key," Margaret said, voice trembling. She was nervous, skittish. Shed dropped a mixing bowl once, and she never dropped its things. And one day she asked if I ever stayed late at the bakery. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed gently. "And what did you tell her?" "That I didn't, that Thomas usually locked up alone." Margaret looked away. She nodded, and then she said she'd seen something, but before I could ask what, Thomas came in from the back. She changed the subject. Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Did you ever ask her again?" "No. I was afraid of what I might learn, and ashamed that I didn't push harder." Tears gathered, but Margaret didn't let them fall. "She trusted me, and I failed her." Miss Marple leaned forward, voice as steady as a stone bridge. "Then help her no tell Hopkins everything, even the small things, what she wore that last day. What Thomas did that made her so afraid." Margaret nodded. Outside, the mist had begun to lift the sky, once gray, no winted, at a sharper blue, but beneath the calm of Willowbrook smithing was beginning to stir. Secrets, like yeast, will always rise, especially when someone dares to lift a cloth and look under Nectar 5, the cellar beneath. The 11th morning mist had cleared, leaving Willowbrook basking in an unexpected warmth that promised an early spring, yet beneath the cheerful veneer of blooming daffodils and chirping birds, a darker undertone hummed quietly at Lennox's bakery. The usual hum of business was conspicuously absent. Its front windows were shuttered, and a faint smell of dampness lingered around the entrance. Constable Hopkins stood near the back door, clipboard in hand, as a small team of officers prepared to investigate Miss Toss. Marple arrived shortly after her steps, deliberate. As she approached the rear of the building, the bakery's back door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into shadow. "This is where I wanted to start," Hopkins said, his voice low. "The cellar beneath the oven." Marple nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. Against a slight chill, the two begun their descent, the wooden steps creaking underfoot. The air grew cooler and damper with every step at the bottom. The cellar stretched out in uneven stone walls, filled with shelves that once held sacks of flour and ingredients, scent of earth, and something faintly metallic, perhaps old rust, mingled in the damp air. Hopkins shone his torch around, sweeping over crates and barrels until the beam landed on a small wooden door, padlocked and tucked beneath the oven's metal frame. "Thomas never mentioned this door," Hopkins muttered. "Supposed to be asterisk space, but he says it's always been locked." Miss Marple stepped closer, examining the lock. In the wood, often secrets hide behind locks that few bother to pick carefully. Hopkins pulled out a set of lockpicks. Fingers steady, despite the tension. After a few moments, the lock clicked open. The door swung inward, revealing cramped space, barely large enough for a single person to stand inside, were a few empty bottles, broken crates, and curiously, a wooden box, worn on splintered at the edges. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. What might this be? Hopkins knelt, brushing aside dust and cobwebs. He lifted the lid. Carefully inside lay a folded piece of cloth, stained and brittle with age. Underneath a collection of papers, some torn, others folded. Meticulous limits, a Marple unfolded, one reading silently. It was a letter. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. To whomever finds this, I am trapped in place, a prisoner of secrets, not my own. If you read this, know that I begged her help and was denied. My only hope lies in this message. A breath caught, and she looked at Hopkins. This is Ilalani's writing, she said softly. She never left Willowbrook. Hopkins looked grim. Why hide it here? Why keep it secret? Because some truths are dangerous, Miss Marple replied, and some leaves are held tight by fear. The discovery rippled through the village by afternoon gossip, rekindled like wildfire with whispers about the bakery's hidden cellar and the fate of the missing Elalina Blake. That evening, as the village gathered at St. Ethelredder's for their weekly core practice, Miss Marple stood quietly by the stained glass window, watching face lighted by candle flames. She knew the truth would not be easy to uncover, but step by step, crumb by crumb, the story was beginning to unfold. Chapter 6. The Whispered Confession. The village buzzed quietly in the days following the discovery of Elenina's letter. Lennox's bakery remained closeted, its usual comforting aroma replaced by a heavy silence that stretched through the empty streets. The weight of suspicion pressed heavily on Thomas Lennox, who avoided public gaze, his eyes shadowed, and his words clipped. Miss Marple, however, found herself drawn deeper into the mystery, piecing together fragments that others overlooked. David was, during a late afternoon visit to the vicarage, that she encountered Margaret Lennox once more, her face pale but resolute. Jane Margaret began hesitant. Lizers, something I need to tell you, something I've kept to myself out of fear. Miss Marple's gaze was steady and encouraged. Jinju may trust me, Margaret. Sometimes sharing a burden is the first step toward relief. Margaret took a deep breath. It's about Thomas. That night, Elenina disappeared. Heard voices in the bakery long after he should have closed up. Harsh words. Struggle. I wanted to intervene, but I was afraid. Miss Marple's heart tightened. Did you hear what was said? Margaret nodded slowly. Not all, but enough. Thomas was furious. Elalina pleaded for something. I don't know what. And then silence. When I checked later, the back door was locked, and Thomas refused to answer. The confession hung between them like a thick fog. Have you told Constable Hopkins this? Miss Marple asked. Margaret shook her head. No, I thought it was none of my business, but now, with everything coming to light, I can't stay silent. That evening, Miss Marple invited Hopkins to join her for tea. Together, they reviewed the events and Margaret's confessions. Hopkins sighed, running a hand through his hair. This changes everything. Teed, Miss Marple replied. It suggests that Elalina's fate may be closer to home than anyone dared suspect. The village's calm facade had shattered, revealing cracks filled with fierce secrets and whispered confessions. Night settled over Willowbrook. Miss Marple sat by her window, contemplating the tangled web of truth and lies. One thing was certain: the ring in Loaf was not merely a token, but a message, and Elenina's story was far from over. Chapter 7. Shadows in the oven room. Early morning. Fog clung stubbornly to Willowbrook's narrow lanes. as Miss Marple made her way once again to Lennox's bakery. The village was quiet now, the usual bustle replaced by an uneasy hush that seemed to seep from thievery walls. Inside the bakery constable, Hopkins waited her arrival. His brow was furrowed and the lines of worry deepened since their last meeting today. They intended to examine the oven room, the heart of the bakery, and as whispered by many, the place where secrets had been baked into the very walls. Thomas Lennox stood by the far counter, his posture stiff and unyielding. His eyes darted nervously as the twantered. "Mr. Lennox," Hopkins began, "we need your cooperation as we inspect the oven room." Thomas said nothing, merely nodded curtly. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, towering ovens, brick-lined, and ancient heavy iron doors, blackened by decades of fire and flour dust. She noticed the small gaps and cracks where the heat seeped out and wondered what could be hidden in their shadows. Carefully, Hopkins and Miss Marple moving around, shining their torches into crevices, probing beneath counters and examining every nook. Then Hopkins paused before a panel near the base of Delagette's oven. "This looks loose," he muttered a dagger. They pried it open, revealing a narrow crawl space behind the bricks. The air inside was stale and cold. Miss Marple peered into the darkness and noticed faint markings etched into the bricks, initials, dates, and mossed chillingly. A series of small scratches clustered as if made by desperate fingers. With a torch, they scanned the crawl space, finding scattered crumbs, a torn piece of fabric, faintly blue, and a small rusted knife. Hopkins carefully bagged the knife as evidence. This could be a hiding place. Miss Marple murmured, "Someone trapped or forced into silence here." Thomas's face palled, but he said nothing. Outside, the village held its breath, waiting for the truth to surface. And in that shadowed oven room where warmth once nurtured life, Miss Marple knew that cold secrets still lingered. Chapter 8. The silent witness. The sun had barely risen over Willowbrook when Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage to meet with Reverend James Fletcher. The man was known for his gentle demeanor and steady presence, appler of the village community. Yet in recent months, a shadow had seen Mead fall over his usual calm. Miss Marple found him seated in his study, surrounded by stacks of hymnals and well-worn leather-bound books. His hands trembled slightly as he poured tea. "I'm grateful you came, Jane," he said softly. "There's something I've been hesitant to share." Miss Marple encouraged him with a quiet nod. "It concerns Leilani." Reverend Fletcher began before she disappeared. "She came to me late one evening. She was frightened more than I had ever seen her. She spoke of hearing voices in the bakery, of something she had discovered that she couldn't ignore." "Did she say what it was, miss?" Or pleased gently. He shook his head, only that it was dangerous and that she feared for her safety. "She asked me to keep her secret, but I fear now that I was not as vigilant as I should have been." Miss Marple reached out and placed a comforting hand over his. "Sometimes even the kindest hearts are silenced by fear." The Reverend sighed. "It's more a week for." She vanished. "Elalina entrusted me with a small package, a folded knot and a ring. She asked me to hold them until the time was right. Taya have kept them hidden, afraid of what might happen if they came to light." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "May I see them?" The Reverend retrieved a small velvet pouch and a folded piece of paper. The ring was unmistakable, rose gold with deep blue sapphire and pearls. The note was brief. "If you do not return, please tell the truth. Find her. Find me." Miss Marple's voice was steady but intense. "Leilani wanted you to be her silent witness, Reverend." Fletcher nodded, tears welling. "I fear that silence has allowed her fate to be forgotten." As Miss Marple left the vicarage, the weight of the note and ring in her pocket, she understood that the village secrets were entwined with its faith. In fears, the truth was no longer buried, it was demanding to be heard. Chapter 9. The missing ingrediente's soft chime of the bakery's bell was absent for weeks, but that morning it rang sharply through Willowbrook as Margaret Lennox unlocked the bee door and stepped inside the village watch with quiet anticipation. Bakery was not just a place to buy bread, it was the heart of their community. Margaret's hands trembled as she arranged freshly baked loaves and pastries on the counter despite the steady rhythm of kneading dough and ringing tills. The shadows of recent events hung heavily in the air. Miss Marple arrived just as Margaret was wiping flour from her brow. The two women exchanged a brief smile and unspoken acknowledgement of the burdens they carried. "I thought it time to return," Margaret said softly. Miss Marple nodded. "It's good to see you." Our conversation was interrupted by Constable Hopkins, who entered with a folder thick with reports and photographs. He handed it to Miss Marple. "Some of the tests came back," he said, the smear on the apron. "It's human blood." Margaret gasped. Quietly, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Tease. Do we know who's not yet?" Hopkins replied. "But there's more traces of the same blood were found in the oven." Crawl spacia. Heavy silence fell. Margaret's voice broke it. "I never wanted this to happen, and ever wanted Elana hurt." Miss Marple took her hand gently. "Somodamus. The missing ingredient is courage to face what lies hidden." Turned to Hopkins. "We must examine the supply chain. Who else had access? Tough Bakery. Any new helpers? New deliveries?" Hopkins shook his head. "Nothing unusual reported, but I will look into its investigation, deepen the threads of truth, weaving tighter around Theobacry's secrets." Outside, the village held its breath one summer, waiting, watching, hoping for justice to rise like fresh bread from dark hidden places. Chapter 10. The Midnight Visitorth. Village clock had just struck midnight when a faint, hurried tapping came at the door of Miss Marple's cottage. She was already expecting trouble, though the timing still surprised her. Opening the door, she found Constable Hopkins, breathless and pale, clutching a folded notian. "Sorry to disturb you so late," he said urgently, "but this was left at the bakerina. One saw who came or went." Miss Marple took the note carefully. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. "If you want the truth about Key Elenina, meet me by the old oak at midnight, alone." The note was unsigned with that hesitation. Miss Marple donned her coat and followed Hopkins through the village, their footsteps soft on the cobbled stones. The old oak stood on the edge of the village green, its branches bare against the night sky. The moon cast a pale glow illuminating beneath this solitary figure waiting beneath it. As they approached, a man stepped forward, one of the bakery's former apprentices, a quiet youth named Henry. Walisi couldn't speak before Henry whispered, "I was afraid, but I know what happened to Elenina, and I want to help." Miss Marple listened intently as Henry reviled a secret long kept. Whispers of a shadowy visitor to the bakery on the night Elenina vanished, an argument overheard in the hidden door in Thassalar. With this new confession, the mystery shifted, the shadows deepened, and the path to the truth became clearer, but no less dangerous. Chapter 11. The hidden door. The chill of early morning lingered. Miss Marple, Constable Hopkins, and Henry Willis returned to Lennox's bakery. Henry led them to a small section of the cellar wall, nearly concealed by stacks of empty flour sacks and a forgotten broom. There, behind a loose panel, was a hidden door, its edges chipped and worn. With trembling hands, Hopkins pushed it open, revealing a narrow passage. Extending into darkness, air was thick and faint traces of dust stirred. With each steps, Mead wanted to keep this a secret, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes scanning shadowed walls. They proceeded carefully, their footsteps hoeing in the confined space. At the end of the passage, they found a cramped room with faded wallpaper. peeling from the walls, scattered about, were remnants of personal belongings, a torn scarf, a cracked mirror, and a worn book of poetry. This must have been Ilalana's hiding place, Henry said, quietly, voice barely above. A whisper. Miss Marple nodded. And whatever fear kept her here may have been what led to her disappearance. Among the items, Miss Marple found a journal with pages marked by hurried scribbles and frantic ink blotches. Ask read aloud. The fragments painted a picture of isolation, fear, and an unnamed threat lurking within the village. Outside, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, casting light on the hidden truths. Emerging from the shadow, chapter 12, secrets behind closed doors, discovery of the hidden room set. Ripples through Willowbrook quietly enslaved the villages as whispers began to spread faster than spring rain. Behind the locked doors of Lennox's bakery lay a secret. None had dared imagine, and Miss Marple knew this was only that beginning. The following morning, she paid a visit to Thomas Lennox's home, a modest cottagist. Beyond the village green, the air was thick with tension as she knocked gently on the door. When it opened, Thomas's face was guarded, his eyes flickering with unease. Mr. Lennox, she began softly, may West speak about Ilanina Blake. He hesitated, then stepped acidly inside. The small sitting room was neat, but bare with only a few photographs. And a heavy silence filling the space. Miss Marple sat, her gaze steady. You must understand. The village is concerned. Ilanina has disappeared under troubling circumstances, and the recent discovery shave only deepened those concerns. Thomas's jaw tightened. I did what I could. Ilanina was difficult, nervous. She was never like the others. Did you ever threaten her? Miss Marple's tone was calm but firm. No, he said quickly, but I admit, I was angry when she questioned me about the bakery nights. I told her to mind her own business, and the blood on the apron, the hidden cellar, the lockador. Thomas swallowed hard. I don't know how any of that happened, I swear, miss. Marple studied him quietly. Secrets have a way of emerging, Mr. Lennox, sometimes from the places we least expect, and she left the weight of unspoken truths pressed down behind closed doors. The real story simmered, waiting for its moment to be told. Chapter 13. The Forgotten Letter. Miss Marple sat by the crackling fire, the soft glow casting dancing shadows across her sitting room. The day's events weighed heavily on her mind, but a small envelope resting on her lap demanded her attention. It had arrived that morning, slipped discreetly under her door. No stamp, no return. Addressed with careful fingers, she unfolded the fragile paper. Inside, the handwriting was in failure, hurried, yet deliberate. If you seek the truth, look not at what is present, but what is hidden. The key lies where? Ilanina feared to tread. Trust no one, for even friends may conceal shadows. No signature, miss. Marple's eyes narrowed. This was no idle note. It was a warning, a guide. Her thoughts turned to the locked cupboard in the bakery's kitchen, the one Margaret had mentioned, but said we were loosed. Could this be where Ilanina hid her secrets, or worse, where someone hoped to read the truth with renewed purpose? Miss Marple resolved to explore every corner of Lennox's bakery, every shelf, every nook, every forgotten drawer. Past was closing in the village of Willowbrook would soon learn whether truth or silence prevailed. Chapter 14. Shadows. Cast by moonlight, night was unusually still in Willowbrook. The moon hanging low and full above the village like a watchful eye. Miss Marple found herself once more drawn to Lennox's bakery, not by invitation, but by instinct. Under the cover of darkness, she approached the back door, noting the faint glimmer of light spilling from the kitchen window through the glass. It's a sallow figure moving silent and deliberate. Her heart quickened. Was it Thomas Lennox or someone else stealing herself? She slipped inside, careful to make no sound. The smell of yeast and sugar filled the air, mingling with something sharper, fear. In the corner by the cupboard, Margaret had mentioned the figure. Paused. Miss Marple recognized the shape immediately. It was Margaret Lennox herself, clutching a small bundle tightly to her chest. "Margaret," Miss Marple whispered, startled. Margaret turned, eyes wide and frightened. "I couldn't stay away," she confessed. "There are things I must tell you, things I've hidden." Together in the moonlit kitchen, truth began to unravel secrets, long buried, whispered confessions, and a pact made in desperation. The shadows cast by moonlight revealed more than just darkness. That night, they illuminated the heart of Willowbrook's deepest mystery. Chapter 15. A pact of silence. Margaret's hands trembled as she sat down. The bundle on the kitchen table, the weight of years spent in quiet fear, seemed to press upon her, and a voice barely rose above a whisper, "I never wanted this." She began, but when Thomas found out what Elalina knew, things changed. Marple listened intently as Margaret recounted a tale of threats, whispered, "Okay," in the dead of night, of warnings issued under breath, and of a pact forged in desperation. Thomas begged Elalina to keep silent. Margaret said, tears glistening. He said it was for the good of the bakery, the village, and our family. But Lenora was afraid. Miss Marple said, softly, afraid enough to hide away, to write letters, to leave messages in loaves of bread. Margaret nodded, and when she disappeared, I thought the Salinas would protect us all, but it only deepened the shadow. Miss Marple's gazettas, steady silence, can protect, but it can also imprison. The truth is a light that once kindled cannot be extinguished. Mark reached into the bundle and produced a small key. "This opens a drawing." "The bakery," she said. Elalina left something there, a final piece of the puzzle. Together they rose, the air thick with anticipation. The time for silence was ending. The time for truth was at hand. Chapter 16. The draw of secrets. Back at Lennox's bakery, the morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the wooden floor. Miss Marple and Margaret approached the old counter, where hidden beneath the worn surface lay a small drawer locked tight with the key Margaret had given her. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the lock and slid the drawer pin inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth ware. Several letters and a small intricately carved wooden K box. Unfolding the letters, Miss Marple began to read aloud. "To whoever finds this, know that the truth is dangerous, but freedom lies within it." The letters detailed Elalina's growing fear, her suspicions about someone close, and a desperate hope for justice. Seat's wooden box, when opened, revealed a delicate silver locket with a faded photograph. Sighed Elalina, and a man whose face was obscured. Miss Marple's mind raced. Who was the man? What had Elalina uncovered, and how far would someone go to keep these secrets buried? Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I wish I had known sooner." Outside, the village stirred, unaware that the shadows were lifting and the truth was finally taking shape. Chapter 17. The man in the photograph. Miss Marple studied the faded photograph carefully. The man's face, obscured by a deliberate crease that seemed meant to hide his identity. The woman beside him was unmistakable, and her gentle smile haunting in its vulnerability to uncover the man's identity. Miss Marple visited several villages howling the photograph and asking discreet questions. Most shook their heads or averted their gaze, but one person, Mrs. Hilda Crawford, Elalina's childhood friend, hesitated. "It might be Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Crawford whispered, glancing nervously around. "Who was a newcomer, a businessman. People said he had influence and a dark reputation." Miss Marple thanked her and pondered implications. Could Mr. Blackwood be linked to Elalina's disappearance? What secrets did he hold as twilight fell over Willowbrook? Miss Marple sensed that the tangled web was beginning to unravel, but the threads were darker and more dangerous than she had imagined. Chapter 18. The visitor's shadow. News of Mr. Blackwood's arrival in Willowbrook. It spread quietly, like a murmur beneath the village's usual chatter. Few had met him, but those who had described a man whose presence cast longanise shadows. Miss Marple resolved to visit Blackwood's estate, a grand but weathered manor at the edge of the village. These sprawling gardens were overgrown, the once manicured lawns now wild and unkempt, a reflection, perhaps, of the secrets held within. Blackwood himself was a tall, sharply dressed man with piercing eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When Miss Marple introduced herself, his smile was polite but cold. "I understand you have questions about Elalina Blake," she said, gently, laughed softly. "Eleanor was a sweet girl, but you must understand there are things in this village best left alone." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. Truthful demands to be known, Mr. Blackwood. Their conversation danced delicately around the old edges of suspicion, but Miss Marple sensed the man guarding something much darker than mere business affairs as she left. The manor, the setting sun, cast long shadows over the village. The visitor's shadow lingered in her thoughts, a silent, watchful presence that would not easily be shaken. Chapter 19. The unseen threat. The days grew shorter, but the tension in Willowbrook thickened like the evening. Elanina's disappearance was no longer a quiet rumor, but a growing concern, whispered in hushed tones at the market and the village pub. Miss Marple had pieced together a troubling pattern. Whispered K, warning secret meetings, and a growing list of those who feared what the truth might uncover. The bakery cellar, a quound, the hidden room, the mysterious Mr. Blackwood, all pointed to an unseen threat lurking just beneath the village's peaceful surface. One evening, as Miss Marple turned homish, found an anonymous letter slipped beneath her door. The message was clear: stop digging, or you'll join her. Her resolve only hardened. Fear would not silence her, and the unseen threat would no longer hide in the shadows. With Constable Hopkins by her side, Miss Marple prepared to confront the darkness closing in on Willowbrook. Chapter 20. The final threats. Village gathered in the village hall, the air thick with anticipation and Dooney's. Miss Marple stood before the crowd, poised and calm, ready to unravel the final thread of the mystery that had haunted Willowbrook for so long. With the evidence gathered, the letters, the hidden room, the testimony of Henry Willis, and the confession of Margaret Lennox, she wove a compelling narrative, laid bare the truth. Elanina Blake had uncovered a secret so dangerous that powerful forces sought to silence her. Forever Rays turned to Thomas Lennox, whose silence had finally broken under threat of truth. He confessed to threatening Elanina in a desperate attempt to protect his family's reputation, but insisted he had never intended her harm. The real danger, Miss Marple revealed, was Mr. Blackwood, whose shady dealings and threats had cast a pall over the village. With the help of the villagers and Constable Hopkins, justice was served as the hall emptied and the village's lull returned to its peaceful rhythm. Miss Marple reflected quietly. Secrets new were like yeast. They would always rise, but truth, like good bread, would nourish and heal. Chapter 21. Echoes of the past. How the mystery of Elalina Blake's disappearance had been laid to rest. Its sidsos lingered in Willowbrook. The village, once cloaked and quiet in the sense of no, carried the weight of its secrets. Openly, like scars healed, but never forgotten, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on how fragile trust could be and how the past, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of reaching into the present. As the seasons shifted, new faces came and went, but the story of Elalina remained a cautionary tale. Spread side fires and over cups of tea from Miss Marple. It was a reminder. Taterbury Village, no matter how peaceful, held stories waiting patiently to be told, and that her work, quietly and patiently, would never truly be done. Chapter 22. A new dawn. Spring returned to Willowbrook with a burst of color and life. The once shadowed streets now basked in sunlight, and the laughter of children echoed through the village lanes. Once more, the bakery reopened its doors under new management, promising a fresh start for the communitatis. Marple watched these changes with a quiet smile. Though the scars of the paste remained, there was hope in the air, a promise that truth and justice could bring healing. As she strolled through the village garden, the scent of blooming roses and freshly turned earth filled her senses. She felt the steady pulse of life and renewal for Willowbrook and for Miss Marple herself. A new dawn had a ripped chapter. 23 whispers of forgiveness, with the village healing in the darkest house. Preceding conversations in Willowbrook began to shift from suspicion and fear to understanding and forgiveness. Families, once divided by unspoken accusations, now found moments of quiet reconciliation. Marple often found herself at the center of these delicate conversations, foreign, gentle guidance, rooted in compassion. An experience believed that forgiveness, like the rising of bread, required patience and care. One afternoon, as she tended to her garden, a familiar figure approached Margaret Lennox, carrying a basket of freshly baked scone. Their shared smile spoke of the unspoken bonds forged through hardship and hope. The mystery had ended, but its lessons would linger, teaching Willowbrook the true power of truth, trust, and the healing embrace of forgivenship. 24. The last piece of the puzzle. Just when Willowbrook seemed finally at peace, a discovery beneath the old church floor shook the village. A new willow renovating the sanctuary workers uncovered a hidden compartment containing letters and journals belonging to Elanina Blake's ancestors. Letters revealing a long history of scraps tied to the Ville's founding families. Miss Marple was called upon, once more poring over the faded documents. The writing spoke of betrayals, lost fortunes, and forbidden alliances that echoed the mysteries. She had uncovered this last piece of the puzzle, revealed that Elalina's fate was entwined not only with recent events, but with generations past. The village, Marple realized, was a tapestry woven with threads, both bright and dark understanding. The past was key to securing the future. Chapter 25. The bread of truth. The village hall was once again filled, this time not with suspicion or fear, but with a sense of closure. Miss Marple stood before the gathered villagers, ready to share the revelations brought forth by the ancestral letters and journals. She spoke of Willowbrook's Layeretta story, how the secrets of one generation could ripple through time, shaping the lives and fates of those who followed. Elanina Blake's story, Miss Marple explained, was part of a larger narrative, one of courage, betrayal, and ultimately truth. The bakery's loaves, once a vessel for a hidden ring, had become a symbol of hope and resilience. Just as bread rises from simple ingredients, so too did the village rise from its shadow. The villagers listened, the weight of years lifted, replaced by shared understanding, lading, and the quiet promise of a new beginning. Miss Marple smiled softly, knowing that while mysteries may never fully disappear, the bread of truth would nourish the soul of Willowbrook for generations to come.